And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 crowns, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power, and his throne, and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole world followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?"
Hi, I'm April Little.
And I'm Anna Jawa here.
And on this episode of Reclaiming the Garden, we're also reclaiming the apocalypse by doing one of our Bible Dyke deep dives into the book of Revelation.
Yes, we are going to prove to you in this month of October, this month of Halloween, that Revelation, not as scary as you think it is.
Yes.
Also, I was telling April earlier as I was reading over that passage, which, by the way, is Revelation 13, 1 through 4. I felt like I needed the Game of Thrones theme song just playing in the background.
Maybe we can get some royalty-free something. Who knows?
I know. If there's like some music that sounds familiar or sounds similar to like Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, whatever, that was the vibe that passage gave me.
Yes. Well, so obviously we sort of start off these Bible Dyke deep dives by sort of talking about our experience of how we were taught about this text when we were in evangelical churches. And so, let's lay out the end times timeline.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the end times what's interesting, it's called a timeline. Some evangelicals, like particularly the ones that I that were in my church, they were always like, oh, no one knows the day or the hour, but like, here is, once the second coming of Jesus happens, here is the order of events that will happen after that. I guess I should say, for those who don't know, in Christianity, there is the belief that Jesus is coming back. That's a big part of our theology, but the way that evangelicals kind of interpret that and think about that, what's interesting is that Dr. Barbara Rossing, a great Protestant or mainline Protestant scholar on the Book of Revelation, she says that they make the second coming of Jesus happen twice. So the first is with the rapture. So the rapture is when all of the believers, the true believers, are taken up from the earth to be with Jesus in the clouds.
Yes, and I'm sure y'all have seen like the photos or the memes of people's clothing just getting left behind. Like when you look up and there's just clothing on the ground, it's because they've been raptured. Thanks movies like Left Behind.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, that if you are familiar at all with the Left Behind novels or movies, like that's what this is. I mean, and the people creating that media believe in that theology. It's not some strange fiction. Well, to them, and so. What's interesting about the rapture, in the Book of Revelation, you don't see this event happen at all. That's not, you can maybe interpret some parts that way, but really the most explicit ways that they interpret the rapture to be a thing that will happen is there's this verse in one of Paul's letters, I forget which one, but he says, we will be changed or taken up in the blinking of an eye, and like that one of the words in there, I believe it's taken up, in the Greek that's rapture, so that's how we get the word rapture.
Gotcha.
And so then after the rapture comes the tribulation, which is where 7 years on this earth God will rain down wrath in various ways, and this is where we actually get more into the Book of Revelation, because the various sorts of plagues and woes and wrath that happen in the Book of Revelation are interpreted to be literal plagues that will happen, literal things that will happen to people.
Yeah.
On the unbelievers who are left, for these 7 years, what's interesting is that people think that evangelism can still happen during the 7-year period. I'm actually looking right now. When you Google end times timeline, one of the first photos that comes up, it shows that the Great Commission is in effect during the Church Age and the Tribulation. So, there's that. And of course, you might be wondering, why 7 years? And honestly, I don't really fucking know. I didn't really do too much research into this, but there's
I know 7 is kind of a big number in the Bible, because it's like 70 times 7 or so. Yeah.
In the book of John, I mean, yeah, a lot of the series of judgments happens in like the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls. So that might be part of it, but also there's also this prophet. Well, you know, obviously the way that they think of prophecy is that it's literal prediction of the future, but in Daniel, there's the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and that's somehow used to, like, some weird math something to, like, just work out that this tribulation is 7 years.
And with all of those 7s, naturally you do have a lot of people who have attempted to predict when the rapture will be.
Right.
And it's so interesting to me, because even if you take Revelations in the Bible completely literally, first of all, why? And second of all, there's verses where it even says no one, not even the Son of Man or the angels,
own words.
will know the day or the hour of his return. So why do you think some, like, white yokel in the middle of America can predict the end of the world so many times and still be wrong, but people still believe it? It's pretty ridiculous. And then, as you were saying, of course, having such a strict timeline of when rapture events will happen.
So after this tribulation, in which people can apparently still get saved, and I guess maybe they immediately get raptured up too, there's the second coming of Jesus, and, you know, in glory and all that jazz. And what happens when he comes back is the 1,000-year reign, sometimes called the millennium. Actually, also, one quick side note. I should say that some people think that the rapture happens after the tribulation, that Christians actually experience that. Like, they're even the true believers. Like, there's a whole debate of pre-trib versus post-trib, is a sort of language. But anyway, so yeah, the millennium, Christ reigns on this earth for 1,000 years is the interpretation, because, I mean, in the book of Revelation, it is, like, you know, it appears to be the Christ ruling with the saints and martyrs for 1,000 years. And then after this, the interpretation is that Satan is loosed upon the earth to try to trick people, to try to get more people to come with him into the lake of fire before before it's too late for him. So, you know, apparently, like, he's gonna just go around with his evil people or whatever. And then after that is the white throne of judgment, where if your name is not written in the book of life, that's, you know, those people go into the lake of fire. Again, this is an image that, you know, is in Revelation. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about, like, we're not going to get too much into hell in this episode, honestly, but we're going to touch on it. And then after that, the white throne of judgment is the vision of the new heaven and new earth. And although, you know, the Bible does use the word new, it doesn't mean it's like a completely, it doesn't mean that this earth is destroyed. So what it really is that it's like a renewed heaven and earth, and that actually, like, the way that I interpret that is that heaven and earth have finally come together, and that God is finally on earth, and this earth is God's home. Yeah.
And it's kind of bringing the, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But like, actually manifesting that.
Evangelicals don't think of it that way. They think, which, you know, really, when you look at the passages, chapter 20 and chapter 21, this isn't there. But they think that after the white throne of judgment, this world, well, okay, in chapter 21 it says the old things have passed away. But, like, again, of course, they interpret that literally to think that, like, this earth doesn't exist anymore. But it's like, no, it means that, like, the way that things used to work, like, that's not how things work anymore, you know? It's like the old way of the old ways of how we have destroyed the earth is no longer there anymore, you know? And that God has actually, you know, restored the earth to its ideal state. Anyway, so we just sort of went through the end times order, and obviously very much based in their interpretation of Revelation, and then we of course were talking a little bit about how to unpack that, but let's unpack it a little more. So,
Ooh.
The end of the world. This passage, this book is not about the end of the world. At least, not in the destructive, violent sense that many evangelicals interpret it as,
Yeah.
It does have things to say about the final destiny of humanity, but we will get to that. Also, just a thing, there are other texts in the Bible that, evangelicals use to formulate this end times theology, particularly, some of the words of Jesus in the Gospels, actually, the signs of the end of the age speeches. But we'll maybe go to those in more detail when we do deep dives on those books. So we're mostly focusing on Revelation here.
Yes.
Also, another thing my church taught, the establishment of Israel as a sovereign state in 1948 was the last thing that needed to happen before Christ's return. This is called Christian Zionism. That's why you might have heard about how evangelicals are very supportive of Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
And that's because, they believe that this needs to happen in order for the rapture to happen. And, of course, what's so sick about that is because they believe that Jews are going to hell and that Jews are going to be in the lake of fire.
Yeah. It's the piece of land that they want and, the control that they want, and it's not about the people at all, which is so ridiculous. And I know that when Trump had kind of said, Jerusalem is the true, capital of Israel, and that's where we're going to move our embassy. I know that in evangelical circles that was seen as, another end times thing. It was right. Moving the consulate from Tel Aviv, which is politically pretty neutral, to Jerusalem, which has so much significance not only for the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, but also the Muslim faith, which is very persecuted in Israel, and especially within the Palestinian territories.
Yeah. And
it was just that extra blow.
So with that, from the pulpit, this youth pastor was saying, on a Wednesday night to these high schoolers that, we're living in a period where Christ could come at any time. And that actually, the natural disasters happening in our world are signs that we are getting close. And I just, oh God. And even, I remember even just hearing it back then and feeling kind of horrified because I was all those unbelievers, those are my siblings, those are my friends. And yet, I would hear my other friends talking about the rapture and being oh, it's so cool, isn't it? I remember once at summer camp, one of my friends was oh yeah, during free time, this, one of the volunteers was talking to us about, all the stuff about the rapture and, the end times, and it was, so cool, and I never had that fascination. I guess...
Yeah. I remember in my youth group, in 2011, there was an end of the world prediction by Harold Camping of Family Radio, and this was kind of a big deal because I even remember seeing billboards.
I remember hearing about that
in California, and he is the end of May. Also, fun fact, as I was googling this, Harold Camping's middle name is Egbert, which I just thought was great. And he's not a very smart egg though. Anyways, I remember we were learning about that there was the end of the world might be in May of 2011, and I'm world is my oyster, 16 years old. I'm I don't want the world to end, even though I knew deep down we're not supposed to predict the end of the world, or not supposed to be able to do that. And in my youth group they were saying the world's not going to end, and it was a few days at that point, in a few days, the world's not going to end, but if it does, you should rejoice because there's better treasure waiting for you in heaven. And whenever I would hear that rhetoric, it's clearly you have no friends outside of the church, because a lot of my friends don't believe this. And I don't want them to suffer on earth and then get cast into a lake of fire. It just, the joy behind it is terrifying, and it sets really dangerous precedent. It's why people don't take care of the earth, because it's gonna get destroyed anyways. It's why we don't take care of other people or give them health care. It's it doesn't matter because the world's gonna end anyways. It's such a dangerous, it's such a dangerous theology.
Strangely, it renders life pointless. And it's also it's so individualistic. It's all just about you getting raptured, and and that nothing else matters.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like, even now, like, when I hear, because, like, you'll still hear things, especially living in California, which is just very natural disaster prone. Some of it is because a lot of the state's on a fault line, but a lot of it is also because we're on fire every summer. Wasn't as bad this year, thank goodness. Knock on wood. But a lot of times you'll see, like, oh, California's burning in hellfire because they like gay people or they like abortion or whatever.
And
like, there's a part of me where I'm like, oh, it's like, that's stupid, obviously, but there is that part of me because I grew up with that doctrine of, like, there are natural disasters and things that are going to happen before the rapture and before the end times. Like, I still, like, hearing that, like, triggers something in me, even though I know it's ridiculous.
When the pandemic first happened, I had, like, a crisis of faith because, like, there was part of me that was like, I mean, I didn't even believe that anymore, but I was, like, asking myself, well, why is God causing this pandemic? Like, I didn't believe that anymore, and yet I was still asking that question because I, like, didn't really have a theology to, like, replace why these terrible catastrophic events happen. You know, and I was also connecting it to, like, oh my God, like, you know, it was said that, like, before the rapture there would be, like, a sickness and famine and all these sorts of awful things that were, like, suddenly happening in 2020, and that, like, triggered some anxiety.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because those things are so America-centric, right? Like, oh, there's going to be famine and everything. It's like, yeah, like, but that's very United States-centric. Like, if you go somewhere else where famine is very prevalent, like, they're not going to see that the same way. Like, that could be, quote-unquote, their end of the world or whatever. Like, or when they're like, oh, there's going to be earthquakes and hurricanes and all these things. It's like, yeah, those things happen all the time. Some of them are going to get worse as the planet continues to warm up, but, like, things like earthquakes have been happening forever. Like, in California and places that do have earthquakes, there are earthquakes happening every single day, but they're too small to feel them most of the time.
Yeah, another thing that's interesting, I guess, talking about, like, you know, people being hot for the apocalypse, I just should say that I just stole that quote from, like, what, in one of Dr. Barbara Rossing's lectures. Seriously, look up, I mean, if you don't have time to, like, read her book, The Rapture Exposed, you should look at some of her lectures that are online, or articles, because I listened to just a few of her lectures, and they were really great. You know, she comes from a world also of, like, environmental activism, and so she talks about the apocalyptic rhetoric in the environmentalist community, you know, talking about that and how that's used, and she talks about trying to, like, reclaim apocalyptic language for our time to be a prophetic word of hope. And we'll get to that a little bit later, but first I should say we mostly have John Nelson Darby in the early 1800s to thank for the rapture and for tribulation. What the actual
Thanks
word
for my trauma.
The word for that is, I believe, generally I should say dispensationalism is, like, the word that most people use to refer to that, because it the reason why it's called that is because it considers Bible history as divided by God into dispensations, defined periods or ages, and so that's why we get this, like, order of, like, different times and things. And, like, really, I was looking things up, I was like, was this, like, just created by him and it just blew up? And that appears to be what happened. Like, I was wondering if this was, like, a movement, and it was, like, just him, and then it got caught on in his church, and then it caught on in evangelical theology.
Yeah, and it's that thing, too, of, like, it's only a relatively recent theology. It's only from, like, the 1800s. And I believe it's later in the 1800s at that. So if anyone is ever wondering, like, oh, we want to teach what the real church taught, spoiler alert, the rapture was not taught in the church
Really,
until that point.
I also, as long as we're talking about historical things, an interesting thing is that there's a quote from Sojourner Truth about her reaction to this theology.
Really?
Yes. So it was quoted by, again, Dr. Rossing during one of her lectures. So I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Here you are talking about being changed in the twinkling of an eye. If the Lord should come, he'd change you to nothing, for there is nothing to you. You seem to be expecting to go to some parlor way up somewhere, and when the wicked have been burnt, you are coming back to walk in triumph over their ashes. This is to be your new Jerusalem? Now, I can't see anything so very nice in that, coming back to such a muss as that will be, a world covered with the ashes of the wicked. Besides, if the Lord comes and burns, as you say he will, I am not going away. I'm going to stay here and stand the fire like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Jesus will walk with me through the fire and keep me from harm. Nothing belonging to God can burn any more than God himself. Such shall have no need to go away to escape the fire. No, I shall remain. Do you tell me that God's children can't stand fire?" And her manner and tone spoke louder than words, saying, "It is absurd to think so." Mic drop.
That's an amazing quote. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
That is, wow.
I know. It's just so defiant. And, like, apparently, I mean, I would have to, like, look back and, after I heard the quote, I, like, looked it up online, and I think she's, like, at, like, this church tent revival, and she, like, stands up and speaks, then says that. So.
That's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I 100%, like, come on, people have been disagreeing with this since the beginning. Like, can we please use our critical thinking skills with this and realize, look, this isn't supposed to be taken this way.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. How was it supposed to be taken? What was the historical and cultural context, and particularly the literary context is so important for the Book of Revelation. Because he is writing in a genre of literature that actually, I mean, it already existed. John didn't invent the apocalypse. Like,
yeah.
Apocalyptic literature was in existence, and in fact, I mean, the Book of Daniel in the Bible also counts as apocalyptic literature with its visions. And it also, like, I guess you could say it's a form of prophetic literature, you know, and it speaks to, yes, I should say, the word apocalypsis in the Greek, it means revealing or unveiling.
Yeah. One could honestly argue that 2020 I call it 2020 my apocalypse year.
Yes.
But it was an unveiling for a lot of people of, like, how truly unequal we are in terms of, like, healthcare, in terms of economy, in terms of...
And there was the reckoning around white supremacy and police brutality. So, yeah. And, you know, what's interesting is that, you know, apocalypse, or even this prophetic literature, it's not this prediction of future things, but rather a warning. You know, it's like, if you keep on going like this, like, you know, this is, the destiny is going to be destruction, and sort of it's destruction that is sort of turned back on you, you know, if you're going to be, if you're going to align yourself with systems that harm people and harm God's good earth, it is going to come back to you in some way. And of course, like, you know, that gets into the whole thing of, like, then why are awful people and demagogues and rulers, like, why don't they necessarily get their comeuppance? And, like, you know, that's probably what the people reading this text originally were thinking too, because they were seeing the Roman Empire and they were seeing them flourishing, you know, and they were being killed for being followers of Jesus.
Yeah, and it was also the notion of, like, the temple that Jesus speaks about before his crucifixion. Like, the temple will be rebuilt in 3 days, and it's, you know, seen with crucifixion and ascension and everything like that, is that the temple itself, which most people thought was going to stay up forever, was destroyed.
Right.
And it was like, oh wow, like, when this temple gets destroyed, that means the end of times may be closer. And that was another big aspect of it. And Reza Aslan goes into this in his book Zealot quite a bit, like, where a lot of it is very speculative, simply because, like, we don't know a whole lot about Jesus, like, outside of the Gospels. We don't know a whole lot, but he kind of uses context clues and, like, how the world was at that time and how, like, the Roman Empire was at that time to really paint a very gruesome picture for when the Gospels were being written, after the life of Jesus, and when, like, Revelations was being written as well. And it's like, no wonder, like, people needed hope that this wasn't going to be the end for them, is that they would die in just bloody battle.
Yeah, like, I mean, Revelation is actually supposed to be a word of hope for people that are really struggling and being oppressed by empire.
Yeah.
But it does still, you know, despite it being for that time and for that people, it also does have eschatological meaning. So eschatology literally means study of last things, and so it's a part of theology concerned with the final events of history or the ultimate destiny of humanity. I fall in more of the ultimate destiny of humanity part of that and what I believe about the book of Revelation. I don't think it speaks to literal timings of things or literal necessarily literal events, but I do believe that it speaks to this idea that God actually is going to make things right, and I have no idea how that's going to happen, but it does give me hope.
It's a very hopeful thing, especially as you were saying earlier, like there's so many terrible people who live their entire lives and never get that comeuppance here on earth, but it does give that hope is that someday they will get their comeuppance. Like, it's, like, that's...
And I should say that, and I guess let's talk about this. Okay, so that comeuppance, in some areas of the book of Revelation, it is attributing that violence to God. In other parts of it, though, it is attributing it to the people themselves. That, like, if you are... there's this image of the cup of wrath, and that, they drink from this cup of wrath that is like the blood of the people that they have oppressed, and, they sort of have to then drink that cup, it's their own violence coming back against them. And so that is not God, that is sort of, I don't know quite what I'm saying, but that's the sort of idea I'm going for, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can kind of see where you're going with that. It's having to almost drink the poison in a way that they brought upon the earth, or to feel the pain that they inflicted upon others. And granted, when you live in a system that has been built on the backs of the marginalized, everyone does or like, not everyone, of course, but like people in power benefit from that, or people that are seen as more in power or more privileged do benefit from that. And it's what you do with that information, do with that knowledge at the end of the day. Like, that's what like redemption is, in the sense, like, for example, like, if I knew that an institution that I really enjoyed was harming people and I still kept going and I still kept giving my money to them, that wouldn't be a good thing, because I'd still be inflicting that harm on others. But if I took active steps to not be a part of that, then I think there's that redemption. I don't know if
I feel like it's like it shows that also, actually, I think Revelation also speaks to the fact that people can change and decide to choose the other side, to choose the way of the Lamb. This image in Revelation, it's the Lamb who does not conquer people or enemies by killing them and, doing violence to them, but by dying for them, actually.
Yeah.
And
which is so beautiful and poetic. Like, it's the people that tout rapture theology so much, I think, really overlook that aspect of it, is like what being the Lamb is, and being one with God and one with Jesus is sacrificing yourself for other people and not taking up the sword.
So also, I guess another thing that Revelation speaks to in terms of a prophetic word is that, not just the Roman Empire is going to fall, but I believe it posits that all empires will one day fall, and that just this pattern of human history, it'll keep happening, but that, all empires will one day fall, and that the violence that is in them will end. And I should say, we're talking about empire a lot, and it's like, abuse of power and all that, and it's like, we all, if you're listening to this and you're, actually, honestly, if you're listening to this, we all play a part in empire in some capacity, we all, even in governments that are not, well, I would say that generally, most governments have some injustice happening under them in some capacity, and some corruption, even ones that have good policies and, like free universal healthcare Canada, there's definitely
Yeah, but then you look at Canada as well, like
With
completely ignoring murdered and missing Indigenous
right,
women, and
yes,
with
that
the
was what I was just thinking.
yeah, and with like the residential schools and everything like that. It's
Yeah, white
every
supremacy is in pretty much like particularly every developing nation, you know,
yeah.
or developed. I guess technically the word is developed already. Well, even that language is like stupid, but
Yeah, I know it's like it's language we know, but it's also like that. I think the word developed is so
I mean that's what you see
subjective.
an example.
Yeah.
The empire is in us too. We sometimes try to reach for language, and we only can find that we use things that are demeaning people when we say that. Like,
Yeah.
you know,
But I think that does also kind of go into the bigger Jesus story of that everyone can be redeemed, but I think there is a repentance that needs to take place. Like
yeah.
I'm glad now that more people, and when I say more people, I mean people who are in positions of power and white people are talking about things like residential schools and murdered and missing indigenous women, indigenous people. Like I'm glad that more white people and people who have been colonizers historically are now talking about that and being like, oh my gosh, what did we do? Like, and I think that's part of that redemption is being able to really repent for your ancestors and repent for other for like people that were harmed by that ideology. And I truly don't believe the work ever really stops with that. But I think that is that power of redemption, is being able to recognize that and being like, I want to work towards and more equitable kingdom come will be done society. And that's the best that we can do. But it is hard when you've been kind of indoctrinated with the empire, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like, you know, in the book of Revelation, like, it's such a clear choice that it's like you can follow this way of Jesus and this, you know, also which sort of connects to this final vision at the end of like the river of life and the tree of life and all people that are living together in this city in harmony with God. And like, you know, there's that way, and then there is the way of violence and of following the beast. And let's get into that. The beast.
It's the vaccine. No, I'm kidding.
Oh my god, yeah, the fact that some people think that the mark of the beast is the vaccine because they're thinking, I mean, like, you know, in their literal interpretation of the text, I'm actually just going to bring this up. Let's just read this out loud, the actual part about the mark of the beast. I just looked up Revelation Mark of the Beast, and the first thing that comes up is no, the COVID-19 vaccine is not linked to the Mark of the Beast.
Oh my god.
Actually, every single one, every single fucking article, well, okay, the first, like, 5 is all about
You know what's stupid, too, is, like, I feel like there's a new Mark of the Beast every couple decades or so, because I know that some people thought barcodes were the Mark of the Beast. Mm-hmm. It's also why I will take this out if it's not correct, but I believe that's why Hobby Lobby doesn't use barcodes on anything. Which I'll research that, and if I'm wrong, I'll take it out of the episode. But also that's why people very easily can quote-unquote borrow things from Hobby Lobby because they don't have barcodes on anything. And then there's people that also believe that, like, credit cards were the mark of the beast because it's like, oh, it's part of that one world currency and a cashless society. And it's like,
so
okay.
Starting Revelation 13, 16, referring to, when I say it refers to the beast. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. Okay, the wording there, number of a person, number
Let's
of
talk
its
about
name.
it.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, of course, people are, like, with the vaccine, people are particularly thinking, like, oh, you can't enter some restaurants if you're not vaccinated. So if it's impeding business, that means that it's the mark of the beast.
It's like, you don't have to go to Cheesecake Factory. Like, calm down, Karen. It's not the mark of the beast.
Yeah, but anyway, so what's so interesting is that, yeah, when you read this part about this, like, when it's referring to the number, I feel like John is saying, like, hey, listen, this is important. Calculate this number. And you're probably wondering, what does that mean? Just gonna bring up my notes here so I can say this well, because I was like, how do I talk about this? The numbers 666 in Hebrew spell out a name, because there's this Jewish numerology called gematria. So in layman's terms, the letters of the Hebrew alphabet are substituted with corresponding numbers. So if you put the Hebrew number 666 back into letters, it spells out Nero Caesar. That's straight up. Like, they were just
and somehow 666 has become like the spooky combination of numbers now, when it had a very specific meaning.
Yeah, and that, like, the letter 6 is evil because it isn't 7 or something, but, like, that it's, 1 less than 7, so short of perfection or whatever. But, like, no, I mean, it's like, John would have been, like, gotten into even bigger trouble than he was already in if he had just straight up spelled out Nero Caesar in Greek or something. But he was like, okay, how do I say this without saying it? And so, luckily, there was this weird way of, like, numbers becoming letters in Hebrew. So
yeah, John knew his audience.
So what's interesting is that other Bibles the NRSV Bible notes that other ancient authoritative texts say 616 as the mark of the beast, because the Latin spelling of Nero Caesar, transliterated into the Hebrew short form, produces the number 616. So that speaks even more to the fact that it's like that it's spelling out Nero Caesar. So,
yeah, like if 666 pops up on your lottery number, it's not like a sign of the devil. It's literally just another number. No different than 665 or 667. It is just a number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, he literally says it is the number of a person. And I mean, of course, people are like, that's the devil's number, I guess is what they say, or like it's the number of the Antichrist, which the word Antichrist is not in the book of Revelation.
I know. Oh my gosh. I also know with like 666, the rock and roll symbol, for people, this symbol, I know that a lot of people didn't like that because they're like, oh, it's like the devil symbol, because it's like, first of all, for people listening, it's when you take your hand and you put down your middle finger and your ring finger, and then you cover it with your thumb, and then your index finger and pinky finger up. It's like the rock and roll sign. So people I remember like a lot of conservative evangelicals would say like, oh, it's like the devil sign because you have the devil horns, the index and pinky finger. But also when you turn it on its side, like the pinky and the loop around, it's like a 6, and then the other side is a 6, and then a 6. It's a lot of big reaching, but that's, I had a friend whose dad was a pastor, and she said, yeah, I'm not allowed to make that sign because apparently it's like the devil's symbol because it has 666 in it.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the other various symbols and numbers and other confusing things that John has in this vision of his. Some people, particularly like when I talk to my dad about this, he's always like, oh, like I want to know what John was on when he was writing this, how high was he? And like literally this week I like talked to one of the teachers at the school that I'm stopping at, and I was like, oh yeah, my next podcast episode's on the book of Revelation, and it's like, yeah, I want to know what he was on. And like, I guess, and of course the sort of like, the inherent sort of implication in that is that like, he was pulling all this out of his ass while he was high, is sort of perspective that some secular people have on this book. And actually, he might have been high, but he wasn't pulling this out of his ass, actually. A lot of the imagery that he uses is straight up out of the Hebrew Bible, like the prophets particularly Daniel, which makes sense given that it's the same genre of literature. Many of the images used in the book of Daniel were referring to the empires of the time, of Babylon and the Persian Empire, and that sort of thing. And you know, a lot of the beasts are like, you look at it, it's you know, there's also some, I think, in Ezekiel, and I guess maybe not, I don't know if there are like beast visions in Isaiah, but there's some stuff about like judgment that's similar, I guess, in Isaiah.
Yeah. And a lot of people see Isaiah as a prophecy, as like the Jesus prophecy, and it could also be a prophecy for something else.
Yeah, and so obviously a lot of these, like, I mean, for example, the text that we started off with, you know, of this beast, like, it represents the Roman Empire, you know, and like there's also another vision of the whore of Babylon, who's another representation of the empire. There is actually some interesting sort of, well, I guess the text doesn't really represent them as monstrous, but they are kind of creepy when you like try to imagine what they would look like. The 4 living creatures, which I believe it's like some weird ass form of like a lion, an ox, a kind of a human, I guess, but not quite, a sort of beast man thing. And what's the final one? Why am I forgetting this?
I'm looking through right now. So, okay. There is the lion represents Mark, the calf is Luke, the man is Matthew, and the eagle is John.
What's so interesting is that, I mean, obviously that's like the church history interpretation, but like, given that John didn't have access to the 4 Gospels, that can't be what he's talking about. So it's, I mean, I guess what I could probably look into this more, but, you know, what I found so far is that it's kind of like maybe the ultimate representations of like these main sort of, I mean, you know, in today's language, we'd kind of call it animal kingdoms, you know? Like the lion of the mammals and the eagle as the bird. And, well, I guess, I don't know. I guess ox and lion are both mammals, but, you know, they didn't have the same...
like cattle.
Yeah, I don't know. They didn't have the same concept that we do today in terms of grouping animals together. So,
And yeah, I found a list of figures in Revelation in order of appearance. Which just sounds like the perfect credits. And also, it starts with John and ends with Hades.
John is obsessed with numbers. Obviously 7 is sort of the symbol for like perfection and God, so that's why there are so many 7s. And then anything that you can divide by 12, usually referring to like the people of Israel, like the 12 tribes of Israel. You know, there's this interesting scene where like John hears, he hears, oh look, there's the 144,000 that were faithful to God, and that are going to be sealed in, that they have the seal of God on their heads, and they're going to be in, I guess, the, you know, heavenly realms. But then what he sees after hearing that, he sees people from every tribe, nation, and tongue. And it doesn't describe, you know, what he sees beyond that, but, you know, Rachel Held Evans has this wonderful description that, like, you know, he probably sees people in saris, and he smells food from all cultures all around the world, and, you know, he hears people speaking various different languages, and I think that's a really beautiful vision, you know, that at first what he hears is that it's only the 144,000 of the Israelite people, and then he sees that it is the whole world.
Yeah. And it's so sad because there are people in my family who believe in like that the 144,000 is a literal number.
That's the only amount of people that are saved.
Yeah, which is such a small number.
Yeah.
And I feel like at that point it'd be like, what's even the frickin' point of any of this? Like that's like such a tiny population of people across all of history. But I love that. I love Rachel Held Evans' interpretation of that, because it takes like this number that some people are like, ooh, like that's the only amount of people that will get into heaven. But it's like, no, it's so many more people from all over, and people. It's just like, that is a really beautiful sentiment.
You know, in many mainline churches, we proclaim the mystery of faith that Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. And in the Apostles' Creed, we also say he will come again to judge the living and the dead. So, I guess, how do we think about the second coming of Christ as progressive Christians? obviously we know that the rapture doesn't happen. There's no biblical basis for it.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, we also are like, you can't predict it, but beyond that, I guess. So I do believe there's going to be some kind of physical second coming. I guess part of me is like, well, I guess there's not much point in like thinking about that, how that will happen, since I mean, part of Revelation is like a call to our actions in the present,
Mm-hmm.
So, do you have any thoughts?
I like the idea of a second coming, I guess, in terms of Jesus, because I don't know. I feel like humanity's been a very interesting experiment thus far. But part of me wonders, does it keep going? Like, it's weird because I think for a long time I avoided thinking about it because
it was associated with all those horrific things.
Yeah, and it was just that thing too. I remember like even as a kid being like, why does it matter what I want to do when I grow up? The world's going to end anyways. Like it's such a sad thing to like teach, especially like younger people. I personally believe that teaching Revelations to children is child abuse, but
well, teaching it in that way,
or teaching it in that way is child abuse, because you wouldn't take your kid to a scary movie. Why is the moon turning blood red and everyone burning? Like, better. Anyways, I think for a long time I avoided thinking about that because of that. But it's also that notion of if Jesus were to come back to earth, like, there could be that renewed sense of hope. Like, it gives, like, a renewed sense of hope. It does. There's no, like, really fear attached to it. But it's like, oh, this person who preached, like, this radical love and acceptance and fought against injustice, like formally taking the throne, I guess. There is something hopeful about that, but I think it's sometimes hard to think about because that message has been so co-opted by other people, by like right-wing evangelical Christianity, and even in certain aspects of politics as well. It's just been so co-opted and bastardized, where it's like, I don't want this to happen. Like, it's like this theology has caused way more harm than good. Like, why even think about a second coming? And it's, I guess suffice it to say, like, as I've deconstructed, I like the idea of it a lot more, but I also am just like, I'm not going to bank on that to happen because I don't want it to affect how I live my life, I guess.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely. In terms of, like, my thinking about eschatology on a grand scale, I definitely like to focus on the concept of the new creation, that God is making all things new, not making all new things, like not making a completely different new earth. God is renewing this earth, these bodies, this plane of existence, and God invites us into the process of restoration in the here and now. And the final vision of the new heaven and new earth in chapters 20 and 21 or the 20 and 21 of the book of Revelation, God comes down to this earth to establish a new way of life. This earth is our home and God's home. Yeah.
So we should really be taking care of it a lot better than we are, but details. But I like that reading of it, because again, we're in that evangelicalism, we're taught that everything's going to be destroyed. And new things will be, it's that thing of like new things will be created instead of creating old things new.
What's so ironic is that it actually literally says in one part that it's like, I'm going to destroy the destroyers of the earth. Like, not the earth. And also, apparently, there are a few words used for world in the book of Revelation in the Greek. One of them does refer to the actual earth, and then another does sort of refer to, like, the world as a whole. But then there's also one that's in the Greek oikumene, which sounds kind of like economics, doesn't it? It kind of,
it does,
sound. And that refers to the Roman world. And so there are parts in the book of Revelation that actually, like, what is being talked about is, I guess, maybe John was able to use that word without getting in trouble, because it also, like, that was just what the Roman Empire started to, like, use for the world. Like, it started off as just referring to, like, this Roman system and economy and everything, and then, like, due to like their whole sort of mythology around the Roman Empire, that the fact they would say that it was like an eternal empire that would last forever, and that it was this perfect world. It became a part of their mythology, and so he was just able to use that word because at the time it meant world.
Yeah, it's like it's so much. It's so much more incredible to like actually dive into Revelation from that historical, like the historical context in mind makes it so much.
Yeah,
I don't want to use the word better, but yeah.
The thing is that like it is supposed to scare us in some sense, but not in the sense that evangelicals say. It's not saying you need to invite Jesus into your heart as Lord and Savior, or you're going to go into the lake of fire, like.
Yeah,
No.
or like you need to convert as many people in your life as possible, or you're directly responsible for their damnation or them being left behind.
It is like this choice, these two different visions of destiny, and and it's like it's supposed to be a warning that like you should follow the path of peace, and. Actually, does it say the word day of the Lord in the book of Revelation, or is that just like what I know that's in Isaiah, but I actually, because like when I was doing a bunch of research about like things that happen in the book of Revelation and like Christian eschatology, day of the Lord came up. It's like this this reckoning. A lot of the visions of judgment that are discussed are sort of referred to as the day of the Lord, Judgment Day, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, another important historical thing. These were written to churches that, like, John knew, Yeah.
like the first, a good portion of Revelation is John being like, this church, I don't like this thing that you do. This church, I don't like this. Like, he just writes to, like, the first couple chapters are him writing to literal churches that existed during the time. It's the seven churches of Asia.
When you're talking about, so I guess I know that you were able to read through some of the first chapters of the Message translation of Revelation. I'm wondering, like, what sort of, I don't know, insights came from that.
It still was very confusing.
He tried his best. Eugene Peterson tried his best, anyway.
Yeah, and for people that don't know what the Message translation is, it's not. From what I've been told, it's not really a translation. It's a paraphrase. It's more like a commentary, I guess. It's like if you want to get the baseline, this is what happens. Well, it's good to read.
I mean, actually, sometimes it's actually not good to read. I mean, because he has, sometimes a skewed perspective. One good thing to read, if you're reading the Message, is to read the book of Ecclesiastes, because he actually uses the smoke metaphor that is in the original Hebrew that is not used in any other English or most English translations.
Really?
So, yes. There's a whole metaphor about smoke. Anyway, we'll get to that when we talk about Ecclesiastes in some episode later.
Yes. But I would say, like, it was still confusing. Like, it's written in more modern language. Like, I could have sworn that the word X-ray was in there somewhere. Because in, like, the sense of, like, Jesus sees through you or God sees through you, and it's like, God X-rays you. For some reason, that confused me a little bit more, to be like, that is a modern word in the Bible. But also, it just... as someone who had to learn Revelation and the rapture and everything at a very, very, very young age, and now I'm reading it from the Message paraphrase, or the Message version, it's still confusing. Like, I don't understand why why people seem to think they have this book completely figured out. Like, because I was still very confused by it.
Yeah.
And it's very, like, methodical. I think, like, that's the thing with the Message translation, too, is it's very methodical of, like, this is this thing, and there's the 7 seals, and there's this, and there's the end. And it's, like, very, like, methodical.
I think this is the most complicated text in the Bible. Like, that's another reason why I'm like, he's not pulling this out of his ass. He's a literary genius. You can't just, like... just also, I now finally had a thought, and I'm wondering if it would be possible for you to actually put this back when we're talking about the second coming of Jesus. Because okay, so when Jesus comes back, and in the passage in Revelation that sort of talks about this final battle, it says that he comes back and he's covered in blood. And I guess, although it isn't explicitly said, one thing that Tim Mackey says in his video from Through the Bible Project talking about the Book of Revelation is that the blood on Jesus is his own. It's not from anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course, like he just comes down and he is already like dipped in blood. You know, like he has not no violence has occurred except for the violence that was put onto him when he was crucified. And so. Yeah, I mean, that's also part of it, is that I don't think, like, Jesus' second coming is going to involve him being violent with, like, a sword coming out of his mouth. Another interesting interpretation from Mackey is that the only weapon is his mouth. That, like, you know, the sword, like, isn't literally there. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful language. It's so confusing, though.
Yes.
And if anyone says, like, I figured out Revelation, they're lying to you. Don't listen to them. Like, you have amazing theologians out there who even say, like, yeah, this book real confusing. Like, it's very confusing, and it's beautifully written.
Yeah, like, even Dr. Rossing, she was actually asked by someone that, like, you know, how do you interpret this violence that is attributed to as being caused by God, and how do you also interpret this language of that this lake of fire will last forever, that there is this existence of people where, you know, this torture goes on forever. And I guess an interesting thing, I mean, she you know, she I think felt that she couldn't quite speak to that, you know, in her answer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she was still figuring that sort of thing out. But an interesting thing that Mackey says in his video is that, like, it seems to be, from his perspective, it seems to be a choice to live in an existence that is without God, that is, they are allowed to be by themselves and for themselves. You know, I don't think that involves necessarily, like, a literal fire thing, you know, and I think that if there is that kind of existence, I think that it is God allowing people to have free will to choose that. That it isn't like, oh, you didn't pray that prayer, so you go there. Like, it's, if you really still want to choose this path of destruction, you can.
Again, there's so much more beauty to it when you are able to dive into that instead of the, like, you say some magic words, you are saved forever sort of deal, which we can totally talk about that another day as well. Yeah, it's, like, this was a doozy to research, but I feel like there's still
lost,
so much to learn.
You can get lost on Wikipedia looking at this. I was just looking at Wikipedia, like, all day Monday.
Yeah, and again, it's incredible to be able to do this sort of deep dive on a book that is so misunderstood and is seen as, like, this is the book that I think a lot of people tend to avoid because it is so confusing. But it's, yeah, even in the research that we've done, I can safely say, I think for both of us, that there's still so much to learn about it.
Yeah, maybe we'll revisit it every October, lol.
Every October we'll do it's still not spooky, it's still not a scary book.
Well, it is scary for people who are just totally fine with oppressing people, you know, but... Any ruler who seeks power, wealth, and influence at the cost of human dignity is Antichrist, you know, even though that word is not actually in Revelation or, like, the Bible, so...
Yeah.
But, I mean, this doesn't mean we should demonize such people, but it does mean we must call them out and organize against their injustice, you know? And although we know that empires will one day end, we also get to take part in the here and now in trying to live the different way, you know?
Yeah.
In making sure that, you know, the rivers of life that we have in the United States are actually taken care of and don't get poisoned by pollution, and that we try to create a beautiful city.
Yeah.
That's a Godspell quote.
Musical episode coming next Tony season.
Yes, we kind of missed it. We thought it was going to be in June, and it was somehow in September.
It usually is in June. Stupid COVID. ruining our possible Tony's musical theater episode. But yeah, oh, what was I gonna say? I was gonna say
I feel
thing.
like
Oh,
we're headed to the end, so you can go ahead. I don't know.
yeah, like one thing I also thought about is again people that align themselves with people who commit injustice and hurt marginalized people. It really kind of also makes you wonder, especially like who like especially in politics, like who are you aligned with? Like you're willing to give up your humanity and you're willing to give up your health to follow certain people in politics, and those could be considered, again, not in the Bible, but antichrist sort of figures, because they're causing you to stray from the actual message of Christ into this other, like, just almost like opposite day version of what Christianity is.
Yeah, and making it very clear again that, like, you know, obviously we both have our own work to do in that, you know, because we are also
100%.
we are under white supremacy and capitalism and lots of other isms.
Yeah, we're products of a system that has benefited us, and all we can do is just do our best to
turn the other way.
That.
I mean,
yeah,
well, not turn the other way, but just turn away. That's what repentance means. You know, you turn away and you keep choosing the way of Jesus. So
absolutely. And one verse that always sticks out to me, and it's obviously very often quoted, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I think we forget to use the word mind a lot.
And also one more fun fact. So another sort of thing from Mackie about Mark of the Beast is that it is the anti-Shema. The Shema is that phrase that you just said. It's originally in Deuteronomy. It means hear, because of course the prayer starts off with "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul." I guess maybe it doesn't. I don't know if the
Deuteronomy.
Says
in Deuteronomy it doesn't say mind,
because
but then Jesus
really,
says it later and says mind.
Yeah, but anyway, so what's interesting is that, actually, I don't think Mackie explains how, but apparently this prayer was sometimes written on the hand or the forehead. And so when this Mark of the Beast thing is saying it was written on the hand or forehead, because it represents, like, your allegiance with your thoughts and actions. And so it's like, you know, think to yourself, like, are you, with your thoughts and actions, are you having your allegiance to God or to something else?
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm so I know that we've gone on for a very long time, but there's so many other things
I knew this was going to be a long episode, but I feel like we've gotten through pretty much most of my notes, and I feel like we did our goal of, like, here is how you can think about the text in a new way. So it's meant to be, it's scary, but it's meant to be hopeful. It's meant to be that all of the bad of this world will be made new. It'll be made better. It'll be made good. Like, it's, and that's where that hope lies. And also I think what the text speaks to is that isn't, like, trivializing our experiences in the present. Like, I think that it acknowledges, the text acknowledges this as, like, a real pain and as something to really lament, you know? Like, God does not take any joy in seeing the world that God created, you know, being like this. So
Whew.
Well, there you go. So my highlight of the week, so next week I start a student small group. It's going to be about through my church, and it's going to be about LGBTQIA history and inclusion. And so for our first session, we're talking about Marsha P. Johnson and sort of pairing her life story alongside the story of the Good Samaritan. In, I believe, Luke's Gospel is what we're going to choose. And, you know, sort of talking about, like, how Marsha loved and cared for her community, and how, you know, and then, you know, how the Samaritan was caring for his neighbors, and so how we can, as modern Christians, how we can care and love for our communities today. So I'm really excited about that. What's your highlight?
I love that. Oh gosh, my highlight of the week, it's such a silly one, but it's been cloudy the last few days, and that's been really nice, and it rained really hard a few nights ago with like lightning and thunder. We don't get a lot of that here, especially not at this time of the year, so it was a very fun surprise. So I've just been living for cloudier, colder weather, which again is a very silly highlight, but I really have been enjoying it. And I guess now to go into ways you can support us. One, we are on Patreon. We are also on all of the social medias, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Likewise, we are available to be listened to wherever you can listen to podcasts. But if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review, because that does help bump us up in the algorithm. We are very, very close to 500 streams, I believe.
Yes. Six away. This episode is going to bring us to it. So, I mean, we can just say here, like, thank you for giving us 500 streams,
yes,
guys.
100%. Yeah. And that's obviously something that we can't do without all of you listening. And I know that we do always mention the Patreon, but even you listening, sending messages, just like, we love seeing your messages.
Yes,
we love
seeing
being
in community with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So even that is incredible. So thank you so much for that as well.
Yeah,
is there anything else?
We can just say we're looking forward to our interview for this month. It's going to be with YouTubers slash. Actually, wait, no. Let me rephrase that. It's going to be with YouTubers slash, if you're in, like, the progressive Christian sphere, you've probably seen them on social media, Angel and Nicole Morris.
Yes.
Yeah. So, it's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, we are so excited to be able to interview them and just chat. We're very excited for this episode. We're also very excited, or at least I'm very excited that we got this interview. So I'm like, yes!
I know, what's so wild?
Excited.
It was, like, in, like, I think October 2018 where I first found their YouTube channel, and so it's just wild to be like, I'm interviewing them now. What? Like,
yeah, and and I know that you probably knew them before, but I had the good opportunity to meet them through the Voyage retreat, and so it's just kind of cool that the podcast was created after that, and it's like coming full circle in a way. I just think it's awesome.
So we'll see you guys then.
Yeah, see y'all in a few weeks.